Okay, this work session on September 2nd, 2025 is called to order. With us, we have Luke from Stifel, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Luke.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for having me. Really, the whole purpose is just to kind of go over Senate Rolled Act 1, the impact that it has, how it changes the property tax structure, the impact it has for the taxpayer. Please stop me at any point with questions. I have some numbers in here that try to quantify what some of this means. I mean, it really changes the entire property tax structure and local income tax structure. A lot of it is getting phased in. Some things start in 26 and end in 2031. Some don't start until 28. Some start immediately. So the kickoff period is a little bit different for everyone. So the first thing, just to kind of start with on that first page, is really the relationship between net assessed value, levy, and tax rate. And we'll see why that's going to become important here in a little bit. But your net assessed value is the taxable portion of your tax base. And if you multiply the tax rate by the value of your tax base, that's the property tax levy or revenue that you are bringing in. So, for instance, the first row, if you have a $1 billion net assessed value, and you have a $1 tax rate, that means that you bring in $10 million in levy or revenue. What a lot of schools have done historically is they manage to do a tax rate. So if your net assessed value increased to, in this example, $1.1 billion, you maintain the $1 tax rate. That means that your levy or revenue that you brought in was now $11 million. Some school corporations, as their net assessed value went up to $1.1 billion, they felt like they didn't need all $11 million. So they said, well, what if we maintain the same levy or revenue of $10 million? Well, to do that, you could lower your rate to that 91 cents. So now 1.1 billion of assessed value times a 91 cent tax rate is equivalent to the $10 million levy or revenue. A possible result of Senate Rolled Act 1 is now to generate that same $10 million. If your tax base is shrinking, your tax base pie is shrinking, and it goes down to $800 million, your tax rate would have to increase to $1.25 to get you the same levy or revenue that you're bringing in. It doesn't necessarily mean that the taxpayer is paying more because of the tax rate. We'll kind of get into some of the math there. But that's going to be a likely cause of some of the changes in Senate Rolled Act 1. And this is going to be the same for schools, libraries, counties, townships, any municipality that has a property tax levy. So just keep that relationship, I guess, in the back of your mind as we work through some of this. So one of the first changes that they made, I guess let me go back to 2023. In 2023, there's a bill that said if your non-exempt debt service tax rate is over 80 cents, then any new project has to go to a referendum. In 2025, the Senate Rolled Act 1, they changed that 80 cent threshold down to 70 cents. So Taylor School's current debt service rate in 2025 was 0.7063, so just over that 70 cent threshold. If that was the only change that they made, we would say this, we can work around this, we just need to lower the rate 1 penny, and this is going to be a fairly easy fix. The hard part is we factor back in that declining net assessed value that's likely going to drive up the tax rate. The other thing that, as you know, is that we authorized $8 million of projects prior to July 1, and that 70 cent threshold is effective July 1. So since we were able to authorize $8 million of the projects, that is grandfathered in under the 80 cent statute. That's why you're not going to a referendum for that $8 million. And as of right now, I think the plan is to issue about $4 million now and then $4 million here in a couple of years. Even if your rate stays above 70 cents, that second $4 million tranche you would still be able to do without going to a referendum. It is at the time of authorization, not at the time of bond sale. But if, for example, we issue all of $8 million in the next couple of years and your rate's at 70 cents, and you say, hey, I need to replace a roof or an HVAC or something, well, then you have to go to a referendum at any point. If you have to go to a referendum now, it's general elections only. So it's November of 26, and then every 2 years after that. So it changes the timing of it, it changes the cost of it, and obviously it changes the fact that you have to actually go put it on a ballot. So our goal with the 8 million is to fund these projects, but also come up with a plan to get you under the 70-cent threshold. So any future project does not automatically have to go on the ballot. It would still be subject to it, but would not automatically have to go to it. The second point here is the net assessed value changes, and this is what really kind of shrinks that tax base pie. So right now, a homestead receives a standard deduction of $48,000 and a supplemental deduction of 37.5%. So a home has their assessed value or the gross assessed value of, let's say, $250,000. They receive a standard deduction of $48,000, supplemental of 37.5%, and that gets their net assessed value or their taxable value of their home. These deductions are being phased in over a 6-year time period. And ultimately, what happens is, beginning in 26, the standard deduction goes down, supplemental deduction increases, to the point that when we get to 2031, the deduction for a home is 67%, or 66.7%. So ultimately, a home is going to be taxed on 1/3 of their actual value. That change, if you don't factor in trending or growth in the home or anything like that, just strictly look at the deductions. As these take place, for a $250,000 home, that's almost a 35% decrease in the net assessed value. So again, you think back to the pie. If you have a tax base entirely made up of $250,000 homes, that means that over the 6-year time period, your tax base is shrinking 35%. Now, of course, there could be trending. There's likely going to be some positive trending upward. I think the question is, do we maintain what we've seen in the last couple of years, the post-COVID home price numbers, or home sale numbers, where they're going up 8-10% a year? Do we go back to pre-COVID numbers where it's 2 to 4% annually? You hit a recession at some point that causes a decrease. A lot of that we just don't know, because this is getting phased in over a 6-year period. The data just simply hasn't happened yet. So for net assessed value in 2026, there's a 2-year lag. So the 26 net assessed value is actually reflective of 2024 data. So 25 will be or 27 will be reflective of 25 data, so on and so forth. So we really only have data of about a year and a half of this 6-year long phase. So a lot could change with what happens to that gross assessed value. The second property tax class is farmland and 2% property. So that's farmland, rental, apartments, senior living communities. They've never received a deduction in the past. So their gross assessed value has equaled their net assessed value. Now, starting in 26, they're going to see an increase in deductions, and it starts at 6% in 2026, and through 2031, that increases to 33.4%. So ultimately, those properties are going to be taxed on 2/3 of what their actual assessed value is. So if your homestead is ultimately being taxed at 1/3, 2% property at 2/3, and then that leaves you your commercial piece. Commercial, no changes in the deductions. Their gross assessed value is still going to be equivalent to their net assessed value. No changes there. The change that they did make is that they're changing the way business personal property is taxed. So right now, if a company has a piece of business personal property, or essentially equipment, there's a 30% depreciation floor. So you start out paying 100%. By year 5, I believe it hits a 30% depreciation floor. Until you replace that piece of equipment, you maintain the 30% floor. Once you replace it, it goes back to 100% and restarts the depreciation table. Once this kicks in, that 30% floor goes away. And then it goes down to, I think, 15%, 5, and 0. So by year 8, they're not paying anything until they replace that new piece of equipment. And that is for equipment that goes into service after January 1 of 2025. They're also including an exemption for businesses with business personal property under $2 million. So right now it's at 80,000. They're increasing that to 2 million. The hard part is modeling that out to estimate it, because every business is going to take a different approach on what they do with their business and what's the average lifespan of X piece of equipment. It's going to differ business by business. Some may purchase a lot of new equipment up front to start that depreciation table and reset the floor. Others may not take that approach. So that part makes it a little bit more difficult to estimate or project what that's going to be. But all three of those things, while it's not necessarily changing your gross assessed value, it is shrinking your net assessed value, and that's again the taxable value that your tax rate is applied to.
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
The good thing is that we are very, very residential here in our area. We have our big taxpayers, we have a couple of big commercials, but we're not very heavy in the commercial side. So I'm not as worried about that commercial, asterisks and what they're gonna do with their equipment, but that residential is definitely gonna hit us.
Thank you.
Renee, it might be a silly question. We've got the residential area, the one big area going in, we know. Is the hotels, the gas stations does any of that come into play for us?
Mm-hmm. They help a little bit. I mean, their tax base is pretty good. The one thing that is, we do know that there is another apartment complex going behind Walnut Creek. Not behind it. Okay, let me think. To the north.
North of it.
Yeah, north of it. So to the side of it, maybe if we want to look at it that way. That's coming in really quickly. They got plans for that. They're already maxing out. They're tipping it, which is a whole different thing on that apartment complex. So it'll max out what they'll ever pay in taxes on it, for 10 years, I believe it was. That housing addition, though, I think it's pretty far down the road. I don't think.
Maybe the way it looks right now.
Yeah, because there's still crops in that field. I don't think it's going to be any.
They're breaking ground will probably spring at the earliest.
I think it's gonna be a while because they've already started the one along Park Road, Park of Zarpin.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to town on that.
Uh-huh.
I can't see them do two projects at once.
Yeah. And I don't know, is that the same developer as that Park in Zartman one?
It's Arbor Homes.
I don't know
Is
who
that-
this
I'm
one.
not sure who has this one down there because it's hard to get any info on it.
Yeah. When I talked to Wes Reed at the redevelopment commission, he's the one who told us that it's gonna be a while till ours down here gets decided.
Do you know what these residential neighborhoods coming in, are they in a residential TIF?
That isn't even TIFed yet.
Okay.
They have applied for TIFs, but, not gone anywhere.
Okay.
And he said they just, asked about the paperwork and that kind of stuff,
Okay.
so.
Good.
I said my hand's definitely up before it passed through though, and so.
Yeah. So the next couple pieces here really relate to the operations fund. The first one is just how the operations fund is calculated. So each school gets a unique maximum levy growth quotient in their operations fund, and then that operations fund levy can grow by the state mandated max levy growth quotient. Changes every single year. There was a formula until it got too high and it capped it at 4%, but it's really ranged from 3.4 to 5%. They said in this last session that in 2026 it is going to be 4%. That was kind of the big win of this bill, or the silver lining, because at one point it was 0% in 26, 1% in 27, and 2% in 28 in one of the original amendments. And there was another amendment that it was going to be a county-wide max levy growth quotient. In most areas, that was going to be less than 4%. So the good news is you get 4% in 26. It's really just in line with what it's been historically. The bad part is we don't know beyond 2026. So they're going to have to come back in a short session and say 27 and beyond, we're going back to the old formula, or it's capped at this percentage, or we're changing the operations fund levy. We just don't know exactly what they're going to do. But that'll be figured out in the short session. The next one is credit. So we haven't had this really before, the way that these take effect, and homeowners receive up to a $300 credit. So it is the lesser of 10% of your tax liability or $300. So if your tax liability is $2,000, your credit is $200. If your tax liability is $4,000, you're capped at the $300 amount. When we start looking at that and you start adding up all the different homestead parcels that are in your district, and that starts to be a pretty sizable number. And for almost every school that we've looked at it for, it's over 6 figures. And that law starts in 2026. There's some additional credits over 65, veteran, blind, disabled. Those obviously are going to have an effect, but not the same effect that up to $300 homestead credit is going to have. Right now, it's an unfunded liability, meaning the state's not coming in and saying, here's if you have a $200,000 loss, here's $200,000 to make up for it, right? It is you and the other municipalities that are truly funding that loss by not receiving that money, essentially. And that is going to be applied proportionally to all property tax backed funds. So your operations fund and your debt service fund. So I think it's fairly likely that they at least evaluate protecting the debt service fund. And the reason for that would be you can only have so much levy for so much cash in your debt service fund. If they start taking away dollars in your debt service fund, eventually schools are not going to be able to repay their debt. If they do that, that's going to cause issues with credit ratings and bondholders. So this happened similar whenever circuit breaker was first implemented in 08-09. They protected the debt service fund. The bad news is that means you take all of the loss in your operations fund. So it's kind of a trade-off, I guess. But that, again, that goes into effect in 2026. They also, along with property tax changes, they really overhauled local income tax changes. So right now, there's really two different ways that local income tax work for school corporations. One is that the county collects local income tax and they give you dollars in the form of what they call certified shares. That's not what Howard County does. They use it for property tax replacement credit. Essentially, everyone pays their local income tax from the payroll. County collects the dollars, and they essentially buy down a homeowner's tax bill. So if their tax bill is $1,000, and there's a $100 property tax replacement credit, it's always a percentage. But if it's $100, that means they pay $900, and the property tax replacement credit funds that other $100. So essentially, you're taking local income tax dollars to buy down the homestead property. What's difficult about it or tricky about it is that if someone is not at their 1% tax cap, so a homeowner can never pay more than 1% of their property, their gross assessed value. So a $100,000 home, the person will never pay more than 1% of that, so $1,000 unless something was passed via referendum. So if someone's under their cap, it's exactly like I just said. It's homeowner pays $900, property tax replacement credit comes in, pays $100, everyone's made whole for $1,000. Same instance though, if their liability is greater than $1,000, that's where you get that circuit breaker relief. That the school or all the municipalities ask for $1,200. Well, the taxpayer pays their $1,000, their credit is for $100, and then there's circuit breaker loss of $100 in that instance. When that property tax replacement credit goes away, now the circuit breaker increases to $200. And I'll show some math on that here in a second. That'll probably make some more sense. But essentially, homeowners that are at their cap, you're going to feel the loss. All the municipalities are going to have an increased circuit breaker loss, meaning less dollars available for your operations fund. Homeowners that are not at their 1% cap are going to see an increase in their tax bill. None of that has anything to do with what you guys are doing on a day-to-day basis from an asking of your community. It's just simply the function of local income tax. Our fear, though, is that people that are not at their cap, they're going to see their tax bill go up and say, who are they going to likely blame? Likely blame the school or likely blame some municipality, even though it's really nothing that you did, it's just a change in statute. So we'll walk through, because you really have two townships and they are vastly different on how this is going to affect them. The last one I put in there, this is probably more down the line, but anytime you increase your levy year over year, even if it is just taking that max levy growth quotient in your operations fund you have to add some additional steps in here for the budget process. That starts in 29, so we have a little bit of time for that. Likely what that means is that Renee's coming to you a month or two earlier to start the budget process.
They love hearing from you.
And when you do that, start a month or two earlier, there's more variables in there, there's less known, so it makes it even more of a guessing game when you start that. So that's the overview of Senate Enrolled Act 1, at least the pieces that I want to focus on for tonight on how it affects you. So I have some specific numbers, but any questions there, just kind of from an overview perspective?
Not yet.
It's a lot.
Yeah. I know, very uplifting as well.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of positives on that.
Yeah.
So if you flip to the next page here, this really just shows that the change in the standard and supplemental deduction for the average taxpayer in your district. So the gross assessed value, the median gross assessed value in your district is $179,100. They receive a standard deduction of $48,000, supplemental deduction of 37.5%. So their net assessed value or taxable value is $81,938. As you work down, you'll see that standard deduction goes from $48,000 down to 0. And by 2031, and that supplemental deduction increases from 37.5% to 66.7%. So now that $179,100 home, instead of paying taxes on $81,938 value, it's at $59,640. And the way the percentages work, or I guess just percentages in general, is that the 66.7 is going to affect the higher end homes even more. They're going to get more of the break because 67% of the larger numbers are larger dollar amount. So a lot of times when we start looking at the lower assessed value homes, maybe the 100,000, 105,000, they're paying about, their net assessed value is about the same, or sometimes even an increase. Whereas the $400,000 homes or above, we're seeing a much larger increase. So then we looked at how does this actually, we're changing all the deductions. Tax base is shrinking, tax rate's going to have to go up. How does this ultimately affect the taxpayer? Because we're jumping through a lot of these to get there. And at the top is the average home value, and that's the exact same chart that was on the previous page. So if you look down to 2031 again, assuming no growth in that home value, that's almost a 28% decrease in net assessed value. The second table there, this is farmland, but these deductions would apply to all 2% properties. So again, that's apartments, rentals, senior living communities, and farmland. And so right now, the base rate is $2,280. In 2026, they changed the formula a little bit, but ultimately they're going to start receiving a 6% deduction. 27, another 6%, 28, 7%, so on and so forth until you get to 2031. And now it's a 33.4% reduction for those 2% properties. So we looked at in 2025, your net assessed value is $470 million. If we apply these deductions proportionally to 87% of your tax base, because 87% is the 1% and 2% properties, going to exclude the 3% for now because that's hard to project. So if we just assume the 1% and 2% properties is 87% of your tax base, apply these deductions proportionally, your net assessed value ultimately goes down to $352 million by 2031. Right now, your levy is $5,156,000 between your operations and debt service. We said, what if you just don't ask for a single additional dollar between now and 2031? We know you're not going to be able to operate that way because costs are going up, but just illustratively to see what that does to your tax rate. And that's that next row there. Right now, your tax rate is just under $1.10. If you don't ask for a single additional dollar by 2031, the tax rate goes up to $1.46. And that's going to be the same thing that happens for your library, your county, your township. Everyone's going to have the exact same issue from a property tax standpoint. So then we looked at, well, if the tax rate is increasing from almost $1.10 to $1.46, surely that means that the homeowner is going to be paying more because of a higher tax rate. But what's happening is that your tax rate is increasing by roughly the same margin that their net assessed value is decreasing by. And that's down there in green. And this shows you really kind of get to the same exact spot. You look at 25, that's just under $900 for the schools portion. By 2031, it's slightly less than that, but it really stays about the exact same. This doesn't factor in the homestead credit or the PTRC, but just simply to look at what does this change actually do for the taxpayer? And when we looked at it, it's not a whole lot. You jump through a lot of hoops, but you kind of get to the same spot from the taxpayer's perspective. So then, I have to think we weren't the first people that caught that, and they said, well, what about a homestead credit, or something to knock down their bill one time? And so then they started factoring in this homestead credit, because this was not really giving any property tax relief. So then you factor in a homestead deduction of up to $300. And again, it's the lesser of 10% or $300. And I'll save you all the math here, but in the top right here again, $470 million, that's your net assessed value. 56% of that is made up of homesteads. 56% of that number is $263 million. The net assessed value of the average home, again, flip back to that first page, the average home being $179,000, is $81,938. Simply divide those two numbers and you get an estimated homestead parcel of just over 32 homestead parcels in your district. We're assuming everyone's at their 1% cap, so that homeowner is paying $1,790 as a max for all the bills combined. So their tax credit would be for $179. Well, if you assume that $179 times the estimated homestead parcels, you get a total loss for all municipalities of $576,000 because of the homestead credit. And that's not going to be applied just to you, because you're not the only one that has a property tax levy, right? It's all the other municipalities. But typically, schools have generally the highest portion of that bill. And that's really because of all the buildings that you have and square footage that you have compared to other municipalities and the general upkeep of that. So then we looked at, based on the district rate, the percentage of your net assessed value, roughly what is that for Taylor schools? And we calculated about $205,000. Not every single person is going to be at their tax cap, so that's probably a little bit inflated, but likely you're starting to lose $150,000 to $200,000 annually in your operations fund. Again, in 26, it's going to be operations and debt service, but ultimately probably operations fund of about $200,000. And that's where the historic property tax relief is coming from, of essentially the $170 tax credit annually for that homeowner.
Luke, how accurate would you say these numbers are, particularly the gross assessed value in our area?
So I took this from Policy Analytics, who's doing their report for you guys. Have they been out yet, Policy Analytics? No. So they have a parcel by parcel level analysis. I mean, it's typically pretty accurate. I know I pulled the Census Bureau data before, and I want to say it was slightly less than that. Sometimes Census Bureau data lags a little bit. So I feel like fairly accurate. Do you feel like it's less or more?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's homes in the heights that have gone for 160, 65,000. They lowered the tax rate a little bit, but I think they tried to pull the wool over our eyes, because all of our assessed values went up $25,000. They just built on the back end of the area behind me, off Center Road. Those were 200 plus thousand. Well, I know Water's Edge and the condo. I mean, that's got to be closer to 225, I would guess.
I think it's really hard because you have to look at, all of our township, on average. So I mean, I agree it is hard to see, and average it out. But Policy Analytics does take the same file that you get from the auditor's office, every single parcel, every deduction. That's what they're looking at right now. And they said that we'll have it, I think they said the middle of September, but probably closer to October with all of these changes. So all the deductions changes, all of this, they're looking parcel by parcel. When the state does it and they, throw out these big grand numbers of how much it's gonna change or save, they kind of just look at an average of everyone and that kind of stuff. So it's maybe led to more sleepless nights for me, but it has really led to seeing where our changes in able to collect property taxes is gonna be. It's gonna be harder and harder and harder every year.
I think sometimes, to your point, Eunice, is that with the assessment, it doesn't always match up to the sale price, and sometimes that lags a little bit, whether it's just the auditor, it's lagging for a couple of years, and in some ways it kind of benefits you as these deductions start to kick in a little bit, as you still have a little bit of that like ripple effect of the upward trending. But I think we've heard that and seen that around the state some too, is that maybe the assessed value doesn't match what homes are actually selling for, or sometimes the data just can lag behind a little bit.
Or it works in reverse. The assessed value is higher than the sell price.
Yeah. So this is the last one that has a lot of numbers on there, so I will apologize ahead of time. But I kind of wanted to show the math behind this property tax replacement credit, because it's pretty nuanced and it's going to really affect your operations fund. And I want you guys to understand why. And again, this goes into effect in 2028 unless your county chooses to take it away earlier. We've heard some counties that are doing that earlier so they can blame it on Senate Enrolled Act 1, for lack of a better word. And they're saying we're going to take away the property tax replacement credit, and then we're going to use a different type of lit. I don't know what Howard County is going to do, but in 2028, the way it's written out, it is going away. So we're going to compare 27 and 28. And the one on the left is a homeowner in Kokomo City, Taylor Township. So they're paying the taxes of the city of Kokomo because they are within the city limits. So if you follow along with me here, the gross assessed value, $179,100. In 2027, that standard deduction goes down to $40,000. Supplemental deduction increases, so comes out to just under $64,000. So their net assessed value is $75,114. The current district rate for someone that lives within this in Kokomo City, Taylor Township, they're paying a rate of $3.82. I know that's going to change by 2027. So if you simply apply the $3.82 times the $75,000, you get a gross tax liability of $2,871. We know statutorily that they cannot pay more than 1%, so they can't pay more than 1% of that $179,000. But all of the municipalities ask combined gets them to a gross liability of $2,871. Well, right now in 2027, there's a property tax replacement credit of around 20 to 22%. So property tax replacement credit buys down that gross liability, and it equates to $633. So now their net tax liability is $2,238, but they can still only pay 1% of that. So they're only paying the $1,791. The difference between that $2,200 and $1,791 is what you know today as your circuit breaker loss, about $447. Well, they're going to receive the homestead credit on top of that of $179, so their final tax bill is just over $1,600. But what is received by municipalities is the $1,600 plus the property tax replacement credit of $633. So municipalities are actually receiving $2,245 almost. We'll move over to 2028. Same gross assessed value, standard supplemental deduction changes as per Senate Enrolled Act 1. So the net assessed value is slightly less, but we're assuming the same district rate of $3.82. Simply multiply the 382 times the net assessed value, and you get a gross tax liability of $2,735. But now there's no property tax replacement credit. So their total liability is $2,735, but they're only gonna pay 1% of that. So they're still only paying $1,791. They get their homestead credit of $179, and their final tax bill is $1,611. They're paying the exact same because they can't pay more than their 1% cap. But what are the municipalities receiving? They're receiving the $1,600, and they're not receiving that property tax replacement credit. So it's a loss to municipalities for this homeowner of over $600. Again, start multiplying that by the number of homestead parcels that fall within Kokomo City, Taylor Township. It's a pretty sizable amount. Move over to someone that is in Taylor Township outside of Kokomo city limits, and it changes quite a bit. So same math, 179,000 gross assessed value. You have your standard and supplemental deduction that brings their net assessed value down to 75,000. But now the total district rate is not $382, it's $2.09. So apply that to the 75,000, and their gross tax liability is $1,573. In 27, they still get that property tax replacement credit, so their net tax liability is $1,226, which is less than the 1% of their gross assessed value. So after you take away their homestead credit, their final tax bill is just over $1,100. In 2028, same thing, work your way down, except now we are removing that property tax replacement credit. They are still below their 1% tax cap, so they're gonna pay the full amount. They're gonna pay the $1,499, take away their homestead credit, and now their net final tax bill is $1,349. So they are actually going to pay $245 more from 27 to 28.
And they're still not at the cap.
They're not at their cap, but they're gonna pay more, so those taxpayers are probably going to ask, why did my tax bill go up? And it's nothing that you did or any other municipality did, it's just a function of the local income tax overhaul. And I do think that's going to be the difficult part for schools, counties, city, everyone to explain this, because it's not a simple, none of this is simple, but trying to break this down for the average person to quickly understand on why that is. So the one on the left, the one on the right is not going to affect your operations fund too much. The one on the left is going to have a drastic impact on your operations fund. And Policy Analytics will show that in what they have, what they're projecting the loss to actually be for your operations fund net levy.
Do we know the percentage of Kokomo City, Taylor Township, and outside the city limits, Taylor Township?
Not in homestead. I could probably get that though, but 71% of your AB is within the city limits, and 28% is without. Yeah. Now some of that may differ though with homesteads, because there's probably a higher percentage of homes outside of city limits, and maybe any commercial that you would have within the city limits.
Well, Indian Heights is 1,000 homes, and it's inside city limits, so that's probably why that's disproportionate that way.
Well, what, about 5 years ago when they did that annex to bypass, and that moved it way out here too. It made my house, I live on Reservoir Road, it moved me into the city limits. And across the street's not, so there's not much left.
All right. Any other questions on that? Again, I know it's a lot of information, a lot of numbers. And quite honestly, I mean, even when I was showing where the tax rate was going to be, that's going to change some, because again, there's going to be trending. There's going to be, if there's new neighborhoods coming in or new businesses coming in, that's going to offset it. Each municipality is going to take a different approach to that. Some, non-school municipalities have other ways to generate revenue. They have local income tax, wheel tax, excise tax, TIF tax, a lot of other ways to offset the loss. Schools have too, property tax and state aid. State aid is tied to students, so if you can't get more students, you really have one way, and that's property tax revenue. So your hands are a little bit tied compared to other municipalities.
So really, we want everybody to now build new homes outside of the city limits.
Or any commercial. So
Yeah.
any new growth would be good. That also brings in a lot of students. So this next slide, we kind of just started putting together because this is a lot to take in. So what are some best practices moving forward from Senate Rolled Act 1? Again, you're a little bit tied on revenue that you can generate. It's not like you're a business that can just raise prices. You're a little bit tied on what you can do. So how do we, within our constraints that we have, how do we become as efficient as possible and maximize the dollars that we have available? So the first thing I'll talk about, we talked a little bit about the communication part. I think that probably is the most difficult because, I mean, it takes an hour-long work session to be able to explain all of it. How do you start dropping this out to your community in small breadcrumbs where they can understand it and resonates with them, so maybe they're not caught off guard in 2028. But I think it is just that communication with the key stakeholders, board, anyone that you think is important to getting to know this information. The other thing is that everyone's going to have to shift from a tax rate strategy to a tax levy strategy. And that just goes back to that standpoint of historically, everyone's managed to a tax rate. That tax rate is going to go up over time. Now that, although it's going up, it may not affect the actual tax bill. And typically when people complain about their tax bills, at least in anything that I've been involved in, they're not complaining about the tax rate. They're typically complaining about my bill went up X dollars. So if you're focusing more on the levy, and even if you are increasing that levy, it's likely going to be not at the 15 or 20% that it may have been because your net assessed value growth. But it's just trying to get that conversation out there that our tax rate's going up, but we're still asking for the same amount of dollars. We're not bringing in any more dollars from that. So the days of having a tax rate, maintaining that's going to change. It's probably going to be focusing more on the levy or revenue that you're bringing in, with one caveat, and that's that we need to make sure we stay under the 70-cent debt service tax rate. So if you do have a boiler break or a chiller hole in the roof, we don't have to go to referendum and wait 2 years to do it. So communications is going to be a big one for all schools and all municipalities, because while they may have some other tools, they still impact them. The second thing is really trying to identify what those losses are. And I've done kind of my back to napkin calculation. You guys have hired Policy Analytics to do a parcel by parcel analysis. They're going to be able to help identify that homestead credit loss and what the loss is because of that property tax replacement credit. So I think they'll have their report, would you say, next month or a couple months, that will really be able to quantify what that's going to be in 26, and as all of this starts to phase in. There's probably going to be changes again in the short session where they clean up this bill a little bit. That will likely have an effect as well. So just identifying what those are so you know what's coming. The first thing is always, look at your expenditures. Make sure that you're actually being as efficient as possible. One thing that we're doing that's already been approved is moving the solar project from operations to debt service. That's shifting about $200,000 annually from operations to debt service. So that's one way to really clean up the operations fund, so to speak. Because really, with Senate Enrolled Act 1, it's impacting your operations fund. It's impacting debt service a little bit, but primarily operations fund. And there's really only 3 ways to change the revenue or expenditures in operations. You can transfer more dollars from education to operations. That's hard to do because you're typically already at your 15%. You're competing with other districts. There's thresholds within that education fund. The only other way to increase revenue in the operations fund is to run an operating referendum. Most people don't want to run an operating referendum. I do think going forward, more and more schools are going to have to. So don't take it off the table completely, but usually that's a last resort to go out to your community for additional dollars. And the last option is shifting. If you can't increase more revenue, then how do you shift expenditures out of operations to debt service? That's what we're doing with the solar project, with this $8 million that we authorized. I think that is really what maybe historically would have been the capital projects fund out of the operations. That's now going to debt service. So, I mean, you guys are doing everything right that you can. It's just going to be pretty limited going forward because you only have so many different ways that you can increase revenue or shift expenditures. We have some planning considerations. I think the biggest thing is that over the next 5 or 10 years, a lot of the projects are going to be not building something new. It's going to just be, how do we fund our deferred or preventative maintenance over the next 5 or 10 years? Whether, I mean, that's roofs, that's paving, windows, doors, safety, security, HVAC, and I know we just did a big HVAC upgrade, but just knowing when all of those updates are going to come, and then see how can we either fit that into operations fund or likely fit it into the debt service fund via a bond issue. That's going to be the most crucial thing, especially for you all, as we need to be able to fund it out of the debt service and stay within the 70 cents while we have a declining net assessed value. So with that, these next couple slides are based on the debt financing, and you guys have seen these slides before, but now just with kind of keeping Senate Rules Act 1 in mind, just want to go over them one more time. So first page, outstanding debt payments. This is just all the outstanding bond issues that you have. You really have, I mean, for the most part, other than the common school fund loan and the 23 GOs, after this year, it's the 2018 bonds and the 2023 bonds. You have a cliff from 26, and then another big cliff when those 2018 bonds are paid off at the end of 2032. So if you flip to the next slide, that's the current debt service levy currently. From 25 to 26, we see a drop in what the levy is. In blue would be moving the solar project over from operations fund to debt service. So we're not changing the term at all with the bank. We're not changing the interest rate. We're just simply changing the source of where the money's coming from. And that's in blue right there. In green is the potential $8 million authorization, up to $8 million. Currently, the plan's to issue about $4 million in 25 to fund some of those deferred preventative maintenance type things, and then keeping $4 million back to be issued at a later date for those other deferred preventative maintenance type things as they arise. You'll see even with this $8 million, from specifically looking at 26 to 27 to 28, so on and so forth, is that your debt service levy is dropping. So the reason we're doing that is that your debt service levy is dropping because your net assessed value is shrinking as well. We want to make sure that we're setting you up to structure these while staying under that 70-cent threshold. It may get a little bit tight depending on what your net assessed value is. The hard part is it's not something that happens overnight. It's not like your AB goes from 300 million to 100 million. It's going to take some time to be phased in, and we just have to kind of sit and wait and evaluate every single year because we just don't have the data yet. That's 4.5 of the 6 years, again, haven't happened yet. So I feel like we do have a plan to get under the 70 cents, to stay under the 70 cents. It's just something that we'll have to be in constant communication about with what happens with your assessed value, what additional legislative changes come up between now and 2031. I mean, they just made the change from 80 cents to 70 cents 2 years after implementing the 80 cents. Is there a chance they lower it to 65 cents or 60 cents, or who knows what the stopping point is? But that's just something we'll have to, again, constantly kind of evaluate to make sure that we're setting you up in the best spot.
One of the hard things is that, yeah, we can make a plan for today and tomorrow and next year, the year after, and then legislation changes all over. You know, even like with the next short session coming, who knows what they're gonna change of this. So I hate to say it, but we have to plan for what we have, the information that we have right now, you know, and that's hard to know that it's probably gonna change later. We're probably gonna have to readjust later. hopefully it'll get better, you know, I don't know. This is really exciting stuff.
It is.
guys.
It is.
So the key here is we just need to be fiscally responsible, really responsible in the next couple of years to put ourselves in a position for whatever happens in 28. And I think a lot of what he had put in the strategies there we've already done or we're working on currently, so
Because we're
I
gonna be
feel like
like
we're
down
Mhm.
for every little thing as soon as it hits.
And as a taxpayer, you don't think about your tax bill for 28, but I think about your tax bill for 28.
My husband does
Yeah.
too, to be honest. All of us are like, oh, he'll be fine doing this, or he'll, oh, he'll
Yeah.
be doing that. Because we've had that conversation on.
I think that's the difficult part too, is even like the local income tax piece with the PTRC. The counties and cities and towns, they're aware of this too and how it's going to affect their taxpayers. So there's a chance that changes before it gets to 2028 even. Or, really, any of this could change, but that seems to be the one that's kind of caught the eyes of, from what we've been hearing, the eye of the legislators, that it's historic property tax relief, but if nothing's changed for counties that offer a PTRC, which is probably about 40 to 50% of the counties, if you're not at your tax cap, your bill is going up no matter what the municipalities do. That's not historic property tax relief. So is that a potential avenue that they would change in the future?
They have to do something because the whole point of all this legislation was to reduce property tax bills. And that's how it was sold, so I would assume that they have to make some adjustment.
Yeah, the hard, when you look at some of this, and I think when you look at it on a broad brush, it does lower taxes for some areas, or maybe even overall. But for a lot of areas, it doesn't impact it. It either doesn't reduce it at all, or even increases it, and doesn't factor into cities, towns, counties can also increase their local income tax now. Does that offset any property tax relief? So I think there's a lot of variables there, and when you start looking beyond that broad brush and start looking at how it impacts each individual taxing district or each municipality, it can be vastly different. Sometimes we go to these conversations and they have a little bit of a loss, but to be honest, with the operations fund, max levy growth quotient, they kind of make up for it in a year or two. It's not really that much more. In other instances where, they're talking about running a referendum as soon as they possibly can because they realize they're going to be out of cash. So it truly is, if you're talking with your neighbors or your colleagues or family that do not live within your district, that first sheet is going to look different, vastly different for every single school corporation and how it affects their taxpayers.
The other thing that Luke had told me is that, if we do a referendum, you only can do it on those big election years. Every other, so it'll be 26, 28, and 30. 28, we already know everyone's property taxes are gonna go up higher. 30, it's a long time out if you need it sooner than
Well, good. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to come with better news.
Maybe next time.
Yeah. As long as we're not talking about this, maybe.
And then we'll update you when we get the policy analytics update on our specific change in assessed value, so.
that. I do know our assessed value for next year did go up 9.7, I believe. So it's a good increase for us, really good. So it is gonna help offset some of these changes.
Well, just so officially, is there any more questions for Luke?
Thank you.
It
Thanks
is
for having me.
5:54, the meeting is adjourned.